My son thought I couldn't understand German. I heard everything he told his girlfriend about me. The call came at 9:23 p.m. on a Thursday, but it wasn't a call exactly. It was my son's voice drifting up through the heating vent in my bedroom floor, speaking German to his girlfriend in the kitchen below. He thought I was asleep. He thought I couldn't understand. What he didn't know was that I spent 4 years stationed in Stuttgart with the Army 1976 to 1980, and another 6 working for a pharmaceutical company with offices in Munich. I'm rusty, sure, but I understood every single word. My name is Leonard Vega. I'm 69 years old, and I worked 43 years as a senior machinist for Raytheon Missile Systems in Tucson. I bought this house in 1989 for $78 with money I saved from every paycheck, every tax return, every overtime shift I could get. My wife Patricia died in 2019 from ovarian cancer. We had 38 years together, good years, hard years, years where we fought and years where we laughed until we cried. But we built something, this house, this life. And now my son was standing in my kitchen, speaking a language he thought I couldn't understand, planning something that would change everything. I pressed my ear closer to the floor vent, my heart hammering against my ribs. His voice was clear, casual, like he was discussing weekend plans. And what I heard in those next 5 minutes made me realize that the son I raised, the boy I taught to ride a bike and tie his shoes and stand up for what's right, was gone. In his place was a stranger who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience. Stick around. You need to hear what happened next. I didn't move from that spot by the heating vent for another 20 minutes. My knees ached against the hardwood floor, but I couldn't pull myself away. Troy's voice kept flowing up through the metal grate, steady and cold, like he was reading from a grocery list. He told Saskia the house was worth $340, free and clear, no mortgage. He said once I was gone, he'd split it with his sister Jenna, and they'd both be debt-free. His girlfriend laughed at something, a light sound that made my stomach turn. Then she asked him a question in German, something about timelines and cooperation. Troy's answer came quick and easy. He said, if I didn't cooperate with their timeline, they'd help things along. Stop refilling my blood pressure medication. I was 70, he said. Actually 69, but close enough. A stroke would be completely natural at my age. I finally stood up, my joints popping, my hands shaking. I walked to my bed and sat on the edge, staring at the wall where Patricia's photo hung in a simple wooden frame. She was smiling in that picture, taken at the Grand Canyon in 2015, her gray hair pulled back, her eyes bright with life. I wondered what she would have said if she'd heard what I just heard. Probably something practical. Patricia was always practical. Troy had moved in 8 months ago after losing his job as a regional sales manager for a medical supply company. He showed up at my door on a Sunday afternoon with 3 suitcases and a story about corporate downsizing. He said it was temporary, just until he got back on his feet. I believed him because that's what fathers do. We believe our children even when we probably shouldn't. Saskia moved in 3 weeks later. She was German, a doctoral student in linguistics at the University of Arizona. Troy had met her at some university event, and she spoke English with barely an accent. Pretty girl, polite enough, always thanking me for dinner. They paid no rent. I cooked their meals. I did their laundry. I tiptoed around my own house so I wouldn't disturb them while they studied or watched TV or did whatever it was they did in the guest room that used to be Troy's childhood bedroom. I lay back on my bed that night and didn't sleep. I listened to their footsteps below, the clink of wine glasses, the low hum of their voices switching back to English once they thought the dangerous part of the conversation was over. They laughed about something. The TV went on. Around midnight, I heard them walk down the hallway to their room, and then the house went quiet. But my mind wouldn't stop. I kept replaying Troy's words, the casual way he'd discussed my death, the specific number he'd mentioned, $340, $100. He'd clearly looked into it, done the math, figured out exactly what my life was worth to him. And Jenna, my daughter, who lived in Oregon with her husband and 2 kids, did she know? Was she part of this? By morning, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Troy, not yet. Confronting him would tip my hand, and then I'd lose whatever advantage I had. The advantage of being underestimated, the advantage of being seen as just an old man who didn't understand what was happening in his own house. At breakfast, Troy asked if I'd been sleeping well. He had this concerned look on his face, his eyebrows pulled together, his voice soft. He said I looked tired, that maybe I should see Dr. Patel about my medication. I smiled and told him I felt fine. Just one of those nights where sleep doesn't come easy, I said. Nothing to worry about. I asked Saskia how her dissertation was going, and she launched into an explanation about language preservation in immigrant communities. I nodded along like I was impressed, like I was just a proud, almost father-in-law supporting her academic work. I didn't tell her that I knew exactly what she'd called me the night before in German. Ein alter Sack. An old fool. That afternoon, while they were both out, Troy at a job interview he'd mentioned, Saskia at the university library, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and Patricia's old address book. I flipped through the pages until I found the number I was looking for, Monica Delgado, the attorney who'd handled Patricia's estate after she passed. I'd paid her $2,800 for her services, and she'd been thorough, professional, and kind during one of the worst periods of my life. If anyone would know what to do now, it would be Monica. I called her office and got an appointment for the next day at 2 p.m. That night I lay in bed again with my ear near the heating vent. Troy and Saskia were in the kitchen, and they'd switched to German again. Saskia was asking Troy if he thought I suspected anything. Troy laughed and said, "No, absolutely not." He said I barely understood English half the time, let alone German. He said I was getting slower, more confused, easier to manage. Saskia asked what would happen if Jenna got suspicious. Troy said Jenna barely called anymore, that she was wrapped up in her own life in Oregon with her kids and her teaching job. He said Jenna wouldn't question anything if I died of natural causes. People his age died all the time. Heart attacks, strokes, falls in the bathroom. No one would think twice. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal. The hardest part was realizing that my son genuinely believed I was too old and too stupid to protect myself. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. Monica Delgado's office was in a low brick building on East Broadway, sandwiched between a tax preparation service and a dental clinic. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in my truck in the parking lot, watching people come and go. A young mother with a toddler, an older couple holding hands, normal people living normal lives, not sitting in their vehicles trying to figure out how to stop their own children from killing them. Monica's receptionist showed me into her office at exactly 2 p.m. Monica stood up from behind her desk and shook my hand. She was in her mid-50s, with short dark hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She remembered me immediately, asked how I was holding up without Patricia, and offered me coffee. I declined the coffee and told her everything. I started with Troy moving in 8 months ago. I explained about Saskia, about the heating vent in my bedroom, about my years in Germany with the Army and the pharmaceutical company. Then I told her what I'd heard, every word, the timeline, the $340, the plan to stop refilling my blood pressure medication so a stroke would look natural. Monica didn't interrupt. She took notes on a yellow legal pad, her pen moving steadily across the paper. When I finished, she set the pen down and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not surprise. Something closer to resignation. She said she saw this kind of thing more often than people realized. Adult children moving back home, taking control, isolating their parents, and eventually making them disappear. Sometimes it was neglect. Sometimes it was financial exploitation. Sometimes it was exactly what Troy was planning, murder dressed up as natural causes. She asked if I had any proof beyond what I'd overheard. I said no, not yet. She nodded and pulled out a fresh legal pad. We spent the next 90 minutes going through my options. Monica helped me set up a revocable living trust with my house and savings. She had me list every asset: the house worth $340,000, my savings account with $53,000, my checking account with $8,400, my truck worth maybe $12,000, Patricia's jewelry worth another $4,000, my life insurance policy for $25,000, total value around $410,000. The terms of the trust were specific. If I died under suspicious circumstances or while Troy was living in my house, everything would go to a charity that builds housing for homeless veterans. Troy would get nothing. Not a dollar, not a dish, not a photo album. Monica said this would protect my assets, but it wouldn't necessarily protect me. For that, I needed evidence. Real evidence. Recordings, documents, something that would hold up if we needed to involve law enforcement. I asked her how to get that kind of evidence without Troy knowing. She thought for a moment, then suggested a voice-activated recorder. Something small that I could hide in the heating vent or anywhere else they had private conversations. She said I could buy one online for under $50. When I left Monica's office, I felt something I hadn't felt in days. Not quite hope, more like purpose. I wasn't just a victim waiting for something terrible to happen. I was a man with a plan. That evening, I ordered a voice recorder on Amazon for $32. It was small, black, about the size of a USB drive. The review said it could record up to 20 hours on a single charge, and the audio quality was clear enough to pick up conversations from 15 feet away. Delivery was scheduled for 2 days later. While I waited for the recorder to arrive, I started paying closer attention to everything Troy and Saskia did. The way Troy checked my medicine cabinet when he thought I wasn't looking. The way Saskia watched me during dinner, her eyes tracking my movements like she was studying a lab specimen. The way they both went quiet whenever I entered a room, then resumed talking once I left. I also started documenting things in a notebook I kept hidden in my bedroom closet. Times and dates, conversations I'd overheard, changes in their behavior, Troy suggesting I skip my morning walk because the heat was too intense, Saskia mentioning that Dr. Patel was probably too old-fashioned, that maybe I should see a younger doctor who understood modern treatments better. The recorder arrived on a Saturday morning. Troy and Saskia had driven to Phoenix for the day, something about visiting one of Saskia's friends from the university. I had the house to myself for the first time in weeks. I opened the package in my bedroom and read through the instructions. The recorder was simple to operate. One button to start recording, one button to stop. I charged it fully, then tested it by placing it on my nightstand and walking around the room talking about nothing in particular. When I played it back, my voice came through clear and undistorted. I waited until dark, then climbed down into the crawlspace beneath the house with a flashlight. It took me 20 minutes to find the right spot, directly below the kitchen, where the heating vent connected to the main duct. I secured the recorder with electrical tape, making sure it was positioned to catch sound from the kitchen above. Then I activated it and climbed back out, my knees screaming in protest, my shirt soaked with sweat. That night, Troy and Saskia came home around 9. I was in the living room watching a documentary about World War II when they walked in carrying takeout bags from a Thai restaurant. Troy asked if I'd eaten. I said I'd made myself a sandwich earlier. They went into the kitchen, and I heard the rustle of the bags, the clink of plates, the scrape of chairs. Then I heard them switch to German. I stayed in the living room, the volume on the TV low enough that I could hear the rhythm of their conversation, even if I couldn't make out specific words. They talked for maybe 30 minutes. At one point, Troy laughed, a harsh sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The next morning, while they were both still asleep, I retrieved the recorder from the crawl space. My hands were shaking as I plugged it into my laptop and opened the audio file. The first voice I heard was Saskia's. She was asking Troy about my life insurance policy. He told her it was only $25, not much, but it would help with funeral costs and other expenses. She asked if Jenna would suspect anything if I died suddenly. Troy said Jenna lived in Oregon and barely called anymore. He said Jenna was so wrapped up in her own life that she wouldn't question a stroke or a heart attack. Old people died. That's just what happened. Then Saskia said something that made my blood run cold. She said they needed to be careful about the timeline. She mentioned that I seemed healthier than Troy had described, that maybe they needed to be more proactive. Troy agreed. He said he'd been thinking the same thing. He said he'd stopped reminding me to take my blood pressure medication, and he'd noticed I seemed confused about when I'd last refilled the prescription. I sat back in my chair and stared at the laptop screen. There it was, clear evidence of their intent. Not just wishful thinking or dark humor, a real plan, discussed in concrete terms with specific actions already underway. I saved the audio file to a folder on my desktop labeled Garden Photos 2023. Then I called Monica Delgado's office and left a message asking her to call me back as soon as possible. But I knew this wasn't enough, not yet. I needed more. I needed to know exactly how far they were willing to go. So I made a decision that would have horrified Patricia if she were still alive. I stopped refilling my blood pressure medication. I didn't actually stop taking my blood pressure medication. I'm not suicidal, and I'm not stupid. But I needed Troy to believe I'd stopped. I needed him to think his plan was working. On Monday morning, I drove to a different pharmacy across town, a CVS near the Tucson Mall that I'd never used before. I gave them my prescription information and waited while they filled it. The pharmacist, a young guy with a beard and tired eyes, asked if I wanted to transfer all my prescriptions to this location. I said no, just this one. He didn't ask why. People probably make strange requests all the time. I paid $23 for a 90-day supply and drove home with the bottle hidden in my glove compartment. When I got back to the house, Troy was in the kitchen making coffee. He asked where I'd been. I said I'd gone for a drive, needed to clear my head. He nodded and went back to scrolling through his phone. That afternoon I told Troy the pharmacy had called about my blood pressure medication. I said there was some kind of delay with my prescription, something about insurance authorization. I made my voice sound frustrated and a little confused, like I didn't quite understand what the problem was. Troy's expression brightened immediately. He said not to worry about it, that these things happened all the time, that I could probably go a few days without the medication while they sorted it out. I said I wasn't sure that was safe. He assured me it would be fine. He said blood pressure medication wasn't like insulin, that missing a few doses wouldn't kill me. The way he said it, casual and confident, made me want to grab him by the shoulders and shake him until he remembered who I was. Until he remembered that I was his father, not some obstacle to be managed and eliminated. But I didn't. I nodded and said okay, that I'd wait for the pharmacy to call back. That night, the recorder caught everything. Troy told Saskia about our conversation. He said I wasn't taking my pills, that the pharmacy had conveniently developed a problem with my prescription. Saskia asked if he'd done something to cause the delay. Troy said no, it was just luck. Perfect timing. He said this was going to happen on its own now. They just had to wait. Saskia asked how long it would take. Troy said he didn't know exactly, maybe a few weeks, maybe a month. He said the important thing was to act concerned, to suggest doctor's visits, to document that they'd tried to help. That way, when I had a stroke or a heart attack, no one would question whether they'd done enough. I listened to the recording 3 times, sitting at my laptop in my bedroom at 2 a.m. Each time, Troy's voice sounded more distant, more like a stranger's. This wasn't the boy I'd taught to throw a baseball. This wasn't the teenager who'd cried on my shoulder when his high school girlfriend broke up with him. This wasn't the young man I'd helped move into his first apartment, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs in 100-degree heat. This was someone else, someone I didn't recognize. The next morning at breakfast, I decided to push things further. I let my fork clatter against my plate halfway through my scrambled eggs and pressed my hand to my forehead. Troy looked up immediately, his eyes sharp with attention. He asked if I was okay. I said I felt dizzy, a little lightheaded. Probably nothing, just didn't sleep well. Troy stood up and came around the table, his hand on my shoulder. He suggested I go lie down on the couch for a few minutes. His voice was full of concern, the kind of concern that would have sounded genuine if I didn't know what I knew. Saskia stood in the doorway watching. Her expression was harder to read. Not quite concerned, not quite satisfied. Something in between. Troy helped me to the couch, his hand on my elbow like I was fragile, like I might break. He brought me a glass of water and suggested I rest. I said I'd be fine, just needed a minute. He sat in the armchair across from me, watching, waiting. After about 10 minutes, I sat up and said I felt better. Troy smiled and said that was good, but maybe I should see Dr. Patel just to be safe. I said maybe he was right. That night, through the heating vent, I heard them celebrating. Saskia asked in German if Troy had seen my face during the dizzy spell. Troy said yes, that I was starting to decline, that it wouldn't be long now. He said they just had to be patient, to play the role of concerned family members. He said if anyone asked questions later, they'd say they'd tried everything. They'd encouraged me to see doctors. They'd been worried, but I was stubborn. The way old people are, I wouldn't listen to reason. The recording was damning, but Monica had warned me that conversations alone might not be enough. Prosecutors would want more. They'd want searches on computers, text messages, attempts to access my financial accounts. They'd want a pattern of behavior, not just words. So I gave them more rope. The next day, I mentioned to Troy that I was thinking about updating my will. I said Patricia and I had made our wills together back in 2015, and with her gone, maybe it was time to make some changes. Troy's entire body went rigid. He asked what kind of changes I was thinking about. I said I hadn't decided yet, just wanted to make sure everything was in order. He suggested I hold off on making any big decisions. He said I'd been feeling dizzy lately, that maybe I wasn't in the best state of mind to be thinking about legal documents. He said we could talk about it in a few months, once I was feeling better. I pretended to consider this. Then I said he was probably right, that there was no rush. That night, the recorder caught Troy in a panic. He told Saskia that I'd mentioned updating my will. Saskia asked what they should do. Troy said they needed to speed things up, that they couldn't risk me changing the will before they had a chance to inherit. He said he'd been looking into things online, doing research. Saskia asked what kind of research. Troy's voice dropped lower, and I had to replay the recording twice to catch what he said. He'd been searching for information about undetectable poisons, about how to induce a stroke in elderly patients, about symptoms of natural death versus suspicious death. I sat back in my chair and felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't just talk anymore. This wasn't just a fantasy they were entertaining. Troy was actively researching how to kill me and make it look natural. I called Monica Delgado first thing the next morning. I told her about the new recordings, about Troy's computer searches, about the escalation. She said it was time to involve law enforcement. She said she'd contact Adult Protective Services and file a report on my behalf. She'd also reach out to the Tucson Police Department and see if they'd open an investigation. But there was a problem. If the police came to my house to investigate, Troy and Saskia would know something was wrong. They'd destroy evidence, delete search histories, maybe even run. Monica said the best thing I could do was get out of the house for a few days while the investigation proceeded, give the police time to gather evidence without tipping off Troy. I told her I'd think about it. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my daughter Jenna in Oregon. She answered on the third ring, and I could hear kids shouting in the background. She sounded harried, distracted. She asked how I was doing, the way people ask when they don't really want to know the answer. I told her I was fine. I asked about the kids, about her husband, about her teaching job. We talked for maybe 15 minutes, surface-level stuff, nothing real. When I hung up, I felt more alone than I had before I called. I wondered if Troy was right about Jenna, if she'd really not question anything if I died, if she was so wrapped up in her own life that she'd just accept whatever story Troy told her. That night, I made my decision. I'd follow Monica's advice. I'd leave the house for a few days and let the police do their work. But first, I needed to set the trap properly. At dinner, I told Troy and Saskia that I was planning to visit my brother in Albuquerque for a week. I said my brother had called earlier, said he was having some health problems and could use the company. Troy looked relieved. He said that sounded like a good idea, that the change of scenery might do me good. Saskia agreed, said it would be nice for me to spend time with family. I said I'd leave in a couple days, just needed to get some things in order first. Troy asked if I needed help with anything. I said no, I could manage. His smile was genuine this time. He thought he was getting exactly what he wanted, me out of the house, vulnerable, alone. He had no idea what was coming. Monica worked fast. Within 24 hours of my phone call, she'd filed a detailed report with Adult Protective Services and contacted Detective Sarah Brennan at the Tucson Police Department. Monica called me Tuesday afternoon and said Detective Brennan wanted to meet with me before I left for Albuquerque, except I wasn't actually going to Albuquerque. Monica had suggested I check into a hotel nearby instead, somewhere close enough that the police could reach me if needed, but far enough that Troy wouldn't accidentally spot my truck. She recommended the Comfort Inn on Speedway Boulevard, about 4 blocks from my house. Close enough to stay connected, far enough to stay hidden. I met Detective Brennan Wednesday morning at a coffee shop on Grant Road, away from my neighborhood. She was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She ordered black coffee and sat across from me in a corner booth. I told her everything, the heating vent, my years in Germany, the recordings I'd made. Troy's computer searches, the blood pressure medication. She took notes in a small notebook, asking questions that felt surgical in their precision. How long had Troy been living with me? When exactly did I first overhear the conversations? Had I noticed any attempts to access my bank accounts or financial documents? I answered everything. Then I pulled out my laptop and played her the recordings. She listened without expression, her pen occasionally scratching across the page. When the recordings finished, she asked if I had the original audio files. I said yes, saved in multiple locations. She nodded and said that was good. Detective Brennan explained what would happen next. She'd need to get a warrant to search my house, which would require presenting the evidence to a judge. She'd also need to examine Troy's computer and phone. She asked if I'd be willing to testify if the case went to trial. I said yes without hesitation. She warned me that leaving the house was the right decision. She said cases like this could go sideways fast if the suspects felt cornered. Better to let them think they were safe, let them get comfortable, and then move in with evidence they couldn't deny. I asked how long the investigation would take. She said it depended on what they found. Could be a few days, could be a few weeks. She gave me her direct number and said to call if anything changed, if Troy tried to contact me, if I felt unsafe. On Thursday morning, I packed a suitcase. Troy watched me from the kitchen doorway while I loaded it into my truck. He asked when I'd be back. I said probably the following Thursday, maybe Friday. He told me to drive safe, to say hello to my brother for him. The concern in his voice would have been touching if it weren't completely hollow. Saskia came out to say goodbye. She hugged me, which she'd never done before. She said she hoped my brother felt better soon. I thanked her and climbed into my truck. I drove exactly 4 blocks to the Comfort Inn and checked in under my own name. The room was small and clean, with a view of the parking lot and a bed that was harder than mine at home. I unplugged the alarm clock, turned off the TV, and sat in the chair by the window. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. That afternoon, Detective Brennan called. She'd gotten the warrant. They'd be executing it the next morning at 6 a.m. when Troy and Saskia were likely to be home. She asked if there was anything in the house I wanted them to be careful with. I thought about Patricia's photo on my bedroom wall, her jewelry in the dresser drawer, the wedding album in the closet. I told her where everything was. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Troy waking up to police officers at the door. I thought about the look on his face when he realized what was happening. Part of me felt sick about it. Part of me felt nothing at all. Friday morning at 7, my phone rang. It was Monica. She said the police had executed the warrant and found everything they needed. The hidden recorder in the heating vent. My medical records showing I'd been refilling my prescriptions at a second pharmacy. And most damning, searches on Troy's laptop for undetectable poisons, how to induce stroke in elderly patients, symptoms of natural death versus suspicious death. They'd also found text messages between Troy and Saskia. Most were in German, but the police had brought in a certified translator. The messages discussed timelines, logistics, and what they'd do with the money after I was gone. In one message, Troy had written that he was tired of waiting, that I was taking too long to die on my own. Saskia had responded that patience was important, that rushing would only create suspicion. Monica said Troy and Saskia had been arrested at the scene. Troy was charged with conspiracy to commit murder and elder abuse. Saskia was charged as an accomplice. They were both being held at Pima County Jail pending a bail hearing. I thanked Monica and hung up. Then I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and stared at the wall. It was over. Except it wasn't over. Not really. I stayed at the Comfort Inn for 3 more days. Detective Brennan called twice to update me on the investigation. The prosecutor was building a strong case. Troy's public defender was already making noise about the recordings being inadmissible, about entrapment, about misunderstandings taken out of context. But the evidence was overwhelming. On Monday, I checked out of the hotel and drove home. The house felt different when I walked in. The police had been careful, but there were signs of their search. Drawers not quite closed all the way, furniture slightly moved, dust on surfaces that had been disturbed. I found the heating vent in my bedroom hanging open. They'd removed the recorder as evidence. I closed the vent and sat on my bed. Patricia's photo was still on the wall, exactly where I'd left it. I stared at her face for a long time. That afternoon, Jenna called. Her voice was shaking. She said she'd just heard about Troy's arrest, that his lawyer had contacted her asking if she'd help post bail. She asked me if it was true, if Troy had really been planning to kill me. I told her to listen to the recordings. I told her the police had transcripts. I told her the evidence didn't lie. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked why. Why would Troy do this? What had happened to him? I said I didn't know. I said maybe it was the money, maybe it was desperation, maybe it was something broken inside him that I'd never seen. I said maybe I'd failed him somehow, failed to teach him that people weren't resources to be used up and discarded. Jenna started crying. She said she didn't know what to believe, that this didn't sound like her brother. I reminded her that people changed, that the person we wanted someone to be wasn't always the person they actually were. She said she needed time to process this. I told her to take all the time she needed. Then I hung up and sat in my kitchen, staring at the table where Troy and Saskia had eaten meals I'd cooked for them, where they'd laughed and talked and planned my death. 2 days later, Jenna called back. She said she'd posted Troy's bail, $50,000. She'd taken out a loan against her house in Oregon to do it. She said he was her brother, that she couldn't just abandon him, even if she didn't understand what he'd done. I told her I understood. I didn't, really, but I told her I did. Troy's trial was scheduled for March. His lawyer was arguing that the conversations were taken out of context, that he and Saskia were venting frustrations but never intended to act. The prosecutor had 47 pages of transcripts and detailed computer searches that said otherwise. I changed the locks on my house. I planted tomatoes in the backyard because Patricia had always loved fresh tomatoes in the summer. I took my blood pressure medication every morning at 8 a.m. with a glass of orange juice, and I waited. The weeks after the arrest were strange. I moved through my house like a ghost, touching things that Troy had touched, sitting in chairs where he'd sat, cooking meals in a kitchen where he'd planned my death. Everything felt contaminated somehow. Detective Brennan called me in mid-August. She said they'd finished analyzing Troy's computer and phone, and there was something I needed to know. She asked if I could come down to the station. I drove there that afternoon, my hands tight on the steering wheel, wondering what else they could have possibly found. She met me in a small interview room with gray walls and fluorescent lights that made everything look tired. She had a folder in front of her, thick with papers. She asked how I was holding up. I said I was fine. She didn't look like she believed me. Detective Brennan opened the folder and pulled out several printed pages. She said they'd found emails between Troy and Saskia dating back 9 months, before Saskia had even moved into my house. The emails were in German, but the translator had provided English versions. She slid the papers across the table. The first email was from Troy to Saskia. He'd written about his financial situation, about losing his job, about his debts piling up. He mentioned that his father was aging, that the house was paid off, that eventually there would be an inheritance. Saskia had responded asking how much the house was worth. Troy had given her the exact number, $340,300. The next email was worse. Saskia had written that waiting for an inheritance could take years, that elderly people sometimes lived well into their 90s. She'd asked if there was any way to speed things up. Troy had written back saying he'd been thinking about that his father had high blood pressure and took medication daily. He'd written that medication was easy to withhold, easy to replace with placebos, easy to manipulate. I stopped reading and pushed the papers back across the table. I felt sick. Detective Brennan said there was more. Over the next several months, the emails showed Troy and Saskia developing their plan in detail. They'd discussed how to move into my house without raising suspicion. They'd researched my financial situation, my health conditions, my daily routines. They'd planned everything, from the timeline to the cover story they'd use after I died. In one email, Troy had written that the hardest part would be acting sad at the funeral. Saskia had responded with a laughing emoji. Detective Brennan said, "This changed things." This wasn't a spontaneous plan that developed after Troy moved in. This was premeditated from the beginning. Troy had moved into my house specifically to kill me. Everything, the story about losing his job, the request for temporary help, the concern about his elderly father living alone, all of it had been a setup. I asked if Jenna knew about this. Detective Brennan said they'd informed her attorney, but hadn't spoken to Jenna directly. That would be my decision. I sat there for a long time, staring at the folder. Finally, I asked if I could have copies of the emails. Detective Brennan said she'd have them sent to Monica's office, that they'd be part of the discovery process for the trial anyway. When I got home, I called Jenna. She answered on the second ring. I told her about the emails, about the 9-month timeline, about Troy planning this before he'd even moved in. I told her that the son she'd posted bail for had been planning to kill me since last fall. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she asked if I was absolutely certain. I said the police had the emails, that they'd been translated by a professional, that there was no ambiguity. Jenna said she needed to call me back. She hung up. She didn't call back that day or the next day. On the third day, she sent me a text message saying she needed space to process everything, that this was too much, that she couldn't talk right now. I understood. I'd had weeks to process what Troy had done. Jenna was getting it all at once. The arrest, the recordings, the emails, the realization that her brother wasn't who she thought he was. In September, I got a call from the prosecutor's office. They wanted to prepare me for trial testimony. I met with Assistant District Attorney James Martinez in his office downtown. He was in his 30s, wearing a crisp suit and a tie that looked expensive. He said my testimony would be crucial because I was the victim and the primary witness. We spent 2 hours going over what I'd say on the stand. He asked about my relationship with Troy before all this happened. I told him about Troy's childhood, about teaching him to work on cars in the garage, about helping him with homework at the kitchen table. Martinez said that was good, that it would show the jury what Troy had thrown away. He asked about the heating vent, about my time in Germany, about the recordings. I walked him through everything. He took notes and occasionally stopped me to clarify details. When we finished, he said I was a strong witness, that juries responded well to people who were clear and credible. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading. He asked if I still loved my son. I didn't know how to answer. I said I loved who Troy used to be. I loved the little boy who'd cried when our dog died. I loved the teenager who'd helped me build a deck in the backyard one summer. But the man who'd planned to kill me for money? I didn't know that person. I wasn't sure I could love someone I didn't know. Martinez nodded like he'd heard that answer before. In October, Troy's lawyer filed a motion to suppress the recordings, arguing that I'd violated Troy's privacy by recording him without consent. The prosecutor countered that Arizona was a one-party consent state and that I had every right to record conversations in my own home. The judge sided with the prosecution. The recordings would be admitted as evidence. Troy's lawyer also tried to get Saskia to testify against Troy in exchange for a reduced sentence. She refused. Her own lawyer was arguing that she'd been manipulated by Troy, that she was a foreign student who didn't understand American laws, that she'd been scared to refuse his plans. The prosecutor wasn't buying it. The emails showed Saskia had been an active participant from the beginning. In November, I received a letter from Troy. It had been forwarded through his lawyer, and Monica advised me not to read it. She said it was probably an attempt to manipulate me, to make me feel guilty or sympathetic. But I read it anyway. Troy wrote that he was sorry. He said he'd been desperate, that he'd made terrible decisions, that he never would have actually gone through with it. He said he loved me, that he'd always loved me, that he hoped someday I could forgive him. The letter was 2 pages long. I read it twice, then put it in a drawer in my bedroom. I didn't respond. In December, the prosecutor offered Troy a plea deal. 15 years in prison in exchange for a guilty plea to conspiracy to commit murder. Troy rejected it. His lawyer was still insisting they could convince a jury that the recordings were misunderstandings, that the emails were taken out of context, that Troy had never actually done anything to harm me. The trial was set for March 12th. I spent Christmas alone. Jenna sent a card but didn't call. I roasted a chicken and watched It's a Wonderful Life on TV. I thought about Patricia and how different the house felt without her. I thought about Troy and how different he felt without the version of him I'd created in my head. On New Year's Eve, I stood in my backyard and watched fireworks explode over the city. The tomato plants had died in the first freeze of winter, but I'd already bought seeds for spring. Patricia always said that planting a garden was an act of faith, faith that the future would come, that you'd be there to see it, that something beautiful could grow from the dirt. I went inside and took my blood pressure medication with a glass of water. The house was quiet. The heating vent in my bedroom was closed tight, and I was still here, still alive, still standing, still waiting to see what justice looked like. January came and went. I marked days off on a calendar in my kitchen, each X bringing me closer to March 12th. The trial date felt like a finish line I couldn't quite reach, always visible, but never getting closer. Monica called me every week to check in. She'd ask how I was sleeping, if I was eating properly, if I needed anything. I appreciated it, but there wasn't much she could do. The waiting was something I had to carry alone. In late January, Detective Brennan contacted me with news. They'd found more evidence while building the case. Troy had taken out a life insurance policy on me 6 months earlier, before he'd even moved into my house. The policy was for $100, with Troy listed as the sole beneficiary. He'd forged my signature on the application. The insurance company had flagged it during their own investigation after Troy's arrest. They'd compared the signature on the policy to my actual signature on other documents and determined it was fraudulent. This gave the prosecution another charge to add: insurance fraud and forgery. I asked Detective Brennan why Troy would need to forge my signature. She said because no insurance company would issue a policy that large on a 69-year-old man with high blood pressure without a medical exam, and Troy couldn't risk me knowing about the policy. So he'd falsified the application, forged my signature, and somehow obtained a copy of my medical records to submit with it. The medical records theft added another charge. Monica said this was good for the prosecution's case, but terrible for me to hear. She was right. Every new piece of evidence felt like another layer of betrayal. It wasn't just that Troy had planned to kill me. He'd been methodical about it. He'd covered his bases. He'd thought through contingencies. This wasn't a desperate son making a terrible decision in a moment of weakness. This was calculated, deliberate, and cold. In February, I started having nightmares. I'd dream about Troy standing over my bed with a pillow. I'd dream about waking up paralyzed, unable to move or speak, while he emptied my medication bottles into the trash. I'd dream about Patricia shaking her head, disappointed that I'd let this happen, disappointed that I'd failed to see what our son had become. I'd wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. I'd take my blood pressure medication early and sit in the kitchen with all the lights on until dawn. Dr. Patel prescribed sleeping pills. I took them for a week, but they made me groggy and disoriented during the day. I stopped taking them and went back to lying awake. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, I drove to the cemetery where Patricia was buried. I brought flowers, red roses, her favorite, and stood at her grave for an hour. I told her everything, about Troy, about the trial, about how angry and tired and sad I felt. I told her I didn't know how to get through this. I told her I needed her, even though I knew she was gone. A cold wind blew across the cemetery. The roses shook in my hand. I placed them at the base of her headstone and drove home. That night, Jenna called. It was the first time we'd spoken since December. She said she'd been thinking a lot about everything, about Troy, about the family. She said she believed me now, that she'd read all the evidence the prosecutor had sent her lawyer. She said she was sorry for doubting me, sorry for posting Troy's bail, sorry for not being there when I needed her. I told her it was okay. I told her this was hard for everyone, that there was no right way to handle finding out your brother is a monster. She asked if I'd go to the trial. I said yes, I had to. I was the prosecution's key witness. She asked if she should go. I said that was her decision. She said she didn't think she could sit in a courtroom and watch them convict her brother, even if he deserved it. I understood. Before we hung up, Jenna asked me if I thought Troy could change, if prison might fix whatever was broken inside him, if there was any chance he could become the person we thought he was. I said I didn't know. I said I hoped so, but hope and reality were different things. I said the brother she remembered and the man who'd planned to kill me for money might be two completely different people, and maybe they always had been. The week before the trial, Martinez called me in for final preparation. We went over my testimony again, practicing questions and answers until they felt natural. He warned me that Troy's defense attorney would try to rattle me on cross-examination, would try to make me seem confused or vindictive or unstable. He said the key was to stay calm, to stick to the facts, to remember that the evidence spoke for itself. I asked him what he thought the verdict would be. He said the case was strong, but juries were unpredictable. He said everything depended on whether the defense could convince 12 people that Troy's words were just talk, just venting, just dark humor that went too far. I said the computer searches weren't humor. The forged life insurance policy wasn't humor. The emails planning my death 9 months in advance weren't humor. Martinez agreed. He said that's what he'd tell the jury. On March 11th, the night before the trial started, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Every creak sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like voices. I kept thinking about Troy sleeping in a cell somewhere, probably not sleeping either, probably going over his testimony with his lawyer, probably planning his defense. I wondered if he felt guilty, if he regretted what he'd done, if he understood that he'd destroyed our family for money he never got. At 5 a.m., I gave up on sleep. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching dawn break through the window. The sky turned from black to gray to pale blue. Birds started singing. The neighborhood woke up around me. I took my blood pressure medication at 8 a.m. sharp, the way I always did. Then I put on the suit I'd bought for Patricia's funeral, dark blue, slightly too big now because I'd lost weight over the past months. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and adjusted my tie. The man looking back at me looked older than 69. His hair was thinner, his face more lined, his eyes harder than they used to be, but he was still here, still standing, still ready to tell the truth. I drove to the courthouse alone. Monica met me in the lobby and walked me through security. She said Martinez was confident that the jury selection had gone well, that everything was ready. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The courtroom was at the end of a long hallway with polished floors and fluorescent lights. Outside the door, people were gathering, reporters, court staff, witnesses. I saw Troy's lawyer, a thin woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp features. She glanced at me and looked away quickly. Then I saw Troy. He was standing with his lawyer near the courtroom entrance, wearing a suit that looked borrowed. He'd lost weight, too. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed. When he saw me, he started to raise his hand like he was going to wave or call out. Then he stopped and let his hand fall back to his side. We looked at each other for a long moment across the hallway. I tried to see the little boy in his face, the teenager, the young man, but all I saw was a stranger who'd wanted me dead. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors. Monica touched my arm and said it was time. I walked into the courtroom and took my seat behind the prosecution table. The room smelled like old wood and floor polish. The judge's bench loomed at the front, empty for now. The jury box waited along the side wall. Troy sat at the defense table with his lawyer. His back was to me. He didn't turn around. The bailiff called for everyone to rise. The judge entered, a black woman in her 60s with gray hair and an expression that revealed nothing. She took her seat and told everyone else to sit. Then she looked at the prosecutor and said the words that started everything. "Mr. Martinez, you may call your first witness." Martinez stood and adjusted his tie. He looked at me and nodded. "The state calls Leonard Vega." I stood and walked to the witness stand. My legs felt steady, which surprised me. The bailiff held out a Bible and asked if I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I said I did. My voice came out stronger than I expected. I sat down in the witness chair and looked out at the courtroom. The jury box was filled with 12 faces watching me, 6 men, 6 women, a mix of ages and backgrounds. Troy sat at the defense table staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. Martinez stood at the prosecutor's table, organizing his notes. The judge nodded at Martinez. He approached the witness stand. He started with basic questions: my name, my age, my address, how long I'd lived in Tucson, what I'd done for a living. I answered each one clearly, keeping my voice level. Then he asked about Troy. I explained that Troy was my son, that he was 42 years old, that he'd moved into my house 8 months before his arrest. Martinez asked why Troy had moved in. I said he'd told me he'd lost his job and needed a place to stay temporarily while he got back on his feet. Martinez asked if I'd charged him rent. I said no. He asked if I'd asked him to help with household expenses. I said no. He asked what I'd done for Troy while he lived with me. I said I'd cooked his meals, done his laundry, given him space to live without asking for anything in return. Martinez paused and looked at the jury. Then he asked about Saskia. I explained who she was when she'd moved in, that she was Troy's girlfriend and a graduate student from Germany. Then Martinez asked the question that shifted everything. He asked if I spoke German. I said yes. I explained about my 4 years stationed in Stuttgart with the Army from 1976 to 1980. I explained about my 6 years working for a pharmaceutical company with offices in Munich. I said I was rusty but functionally fluent. Martinez asked if Troy knew I spoke German. I said no. He'd never asked, and I'd never mentioned it. It hadn't seemed relevant. The courtroom went very quiet. Martinez asked me to tell the jury what happened on the night of November 17th. I took a breath and began. I explained about the heating vent in my bedroom floor. I explained how sound traveled up through the ductwork from the kitchen below. I explained that on that particular Thursday night, I was lying in bed when I heard Troy's voice drifting up through the vent, speaking German to Saskia. Martinez asked what Troy had said. I repeated it word for word, first in German, then in English. I told the jury how Troy had discussed the house being worth $340, how he'd mentioned splitting it with his sister after I was gone, how Saskia had asked about speeding up the timeline, how Troy had suggested withholding my blood pressure medication so a stroke would look natural. Several jurors leaned forward in their seats. One woman in the back row brought her hand to her mouth. Martinez asked what I'd done after hearing that conversation. I explained about lying awake all night, about calling the attorney, Monica Delgado, about setting up the living trust to protect my assets. Then Martinez introduced the recordings. He played them for the jury, 47 pages of transcripts condensed into 15 minutes of audio. Troy's voice filled the courtroom, speaking German in that casual tone I'd heard through the heating vent. The certified translator had added English subtitles to the audio file so the jury could read along. They heard Troy discuss my life insurance policy. They heard him say that Jenna wouldn't suspect anything if I died of natural causes. They heard Saskia suggest they needed to be more proactive. They heard Troy agree that he'd been thinking the same thing. When the recording ended, the courtroom was silent. I looked at the jury. Several of them were staring at Troy with expressions that ranged from shock to disgust. Martinez then introduced the emails. He walked the jury through each one, starting with the initial conversation 9 months before Troy had moved into my house. He showed them how Troy and Saskia had planned everything: the timeline, the cover story, the method. He introduced the forged life insurance policy. He explained how Troy had faked my signature, stolen my medical records, and attempted to take out a $100,000 policy on my life without my knowledge. Finally, Martinez asked about the computer searches. He displayed screenshots on a large monitor, searches for undetectable poisons, how to induce stroke in elderly patients, symptoms of natural death versus suspicious death. The dates on the searches corresponded with Troy's conversations in the recordings. Martinez asked if I'd ever given Troy permission to research ways to kill me. I said no. He asked if I'd ever discussed ending my life or wanting to die. I said no, that I'd wanted to live, that I still wanted to live. He asked how it felt to know my son had been planning my murder. I looked at Troy for the first time since I'd taken the stand. He was staring at the table in front of him, his face pale. I said it felt like losing him twice, once to the person he'd become, and once to the realization that the son I'd known might never have existed at all. Martinez thanked me and sat down. Then Troy's defense attorney stood up. Her name was Barbara Sinclair, and she approached the witness stand with a thin smile. She started by asking if I was sure I'd heard Troy correctly through the heating vent. I said yes, I was certain. She asked if it was possible I'd misunderstood. I said no, my German was good enough to understand what was being said. She asked if I'd ever considered that Troy and Saskia might have been joking, engaging in dark humor, venting frustrations about caregiving stress. I said the computer searches and forged insurance policy weren't jokes. She asked if I'd felt burdened by Troy and Saskia living in my house. I said no, I'd welcome them. She asked if there had been any conflict between us before I overheard the conversation. I said no, we'd gotten along fine. She asked if I'd ever threatened to disinherit Troy. I said no, not until after I'd heard him planning to kill me. She tried several more approaches, suggesting I was confused, suggesting I'd taken things out of context, suggesting I'd overreacted to normal family frustrations. I answered each question calmly, sticking to the facts, letting the evidence speak for itself. Finally, she asked if I still loved my son. I looked at Troy again. He'd raised his head and was watching me now, his eyes red. I said I loved who I thought he was. I said I grieved for that person. But the man who'd planned to murder me for money? I didn't know him well enough to love him. Sinclair had no more questions. Martinez stood for redirect but said he had nothing further. The judge thanked me and said I could step down. I walked back to my seat behind the prosecution table. My legs were shaking now, but I made it without stumbling. The trial continued for 3 more days. The prosecution called Detective Brennan, who testified about the evidence they'd found. They called the certified translator who verified the accuracy of the German transcripts. They called the insurance investigator who explained the forged policy. They called Monica Delgado, who testified about the living trust and my mental competency. The defense called character witnesses, people who said Troy was a good person, that he'd never hurt anyone, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. They called an expert witness who suggested that the recordings might have been taken out of context, that people sometimes said things they didn't mean when they were stressed. But they didn't call Troy. He never took the stand. His lawyer had probably advised him that cross-examination would destroy him. On March the 16th, both sides gave closing arguments. Martinez stood in front of the jury and walked them through the evidence again. He said this wasn't a case about misunderstandings or dark humor. This was a case about premeditated murder, about a son who'd seen his father as nothing more than an obstacle between him and money. He said the evidence proved Troy had planned this for 9 months. He'd moved into my house specifically to kill me. He'd researched methods. He'd taken steps to withhold my medication. He'd forged an insurance policy. He'd discussed timelines and logistics with his girlfriend in a language he thought I couldn't understand. Martinez said this was a case about a fundamental betrayal of trust, about an elderly man who'd opened his home to his son and nearly paid for that kindness with his life. Sinclair gave the defense's closing argument. She said the prosecution had built a case on words, not actions. She said Troy had never actually harmed me, never actually withheld medication, never actually done anything except talk. She said the recordings were troubling, but didn't prove intent to commit murder. She said the jury should find Troy not guilty, because talking about something wasn't the same as doing it. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, the forewoman stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, insurance fraud, forgery, theft of medical records. Troy's face crumbled. His lawyer put her hand on his shoulder. The judge thanked the jury and set sentencing for April 15th. I sat in the courtroom and felt nothing, not relief, not satisfaction, just a hollow emptiness where something used to be. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Martinez asking for comments. He said justice had been served, that elder abuse was a serious crime, that families needed to protect their vulnerable members. Monica walked me to my truck. She asked if I was okay. I said I didn't know. She said that was honest. She said to call her if I needed anything. I drove home alone. The house was quiet when I walked in. I made myself dinner, chicken and rice, nothing special. I took my blood pressure medication at 8 p.m. with a glass of orange juice. Then I sat in my living room and stared at the wall until it was time to sleep. The sentencing hearing was on April 15th, a Tuesday morning with clouds threatening rain. I drove to the courthouse alone, parked in the same spot I'd used during the trial, and walked through the same metal detectors. Everything felt like a repeat performance, except this time I knew how it ended. The courtroom was less crowded than it had been during the trial, a few reporters, some court staff. Monica sat beside me in the gallery. Troy sat at the defense table with Barbara Sinclair, wearing the same borrowed suit. He looked thinner than he had a month ago. The judge entered, and we all stood. She took her seat and reviewed the pre-sentencing report. Then she asked if either side wanted to make a statement before she imposed sentence. Martinez stood. He said the state recommended the maximum sentence allowed by law, 25 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder, to be served consecutively with sentences for the other charges. He said this was a case of extraordinary betrayal, that Troy had exploited his father's trust and generosity in the worst possible way. Sinclair stood and asked for leniency. She said Troy had no prior criminal record, that he'd been going through financial hardship, that he'd made terrible decisions, but hadn't actually harmed anyone. She asked the judge to consider a lighter sentence that would give Troy a chance at rehabilitation. Then the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. Monica had prepared me for this possibility, but I hadn't decided until that moment whether I'd actually do it. I stood and walked to the podium. Troy watched me approach, his eyes following my movement. I adjusted the microphone and looked at the judge. I said I'd spent the last 5 months trying to understand how my son became the kind of man who could plan his father's murder. I'd gone through old photo albums, read old letters, searched for the moment where things went wrong. I said I still didn't have an answer. I told the judge about raising Troy, about teaching him to ride a bike on the street in front of our house, about helping him with algebra homework at the kitchen table, about watching him graduate from college, get his first job, build what I thought was a good life. I said I'd been proud of him. I'd believed in him. When he showed up at my door 8 months ago saying he needed help, I'd welcomed him without hesitation, because that's what fathers do. We help our children. I said what Troy had done wasn't a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. The email showed he'd been planning this for 9 months before he ever moved into my house. He'd researched methods. He'd forged documents. He'd taken deliberate steps to make my death look natural. I said the hardest part wasn't that he'd planned to kill me. The hardest part was that he'd underestimated me so completely. He'd thought I was just an old man, too tired and too ignorant to understand what was happening. He'd thought speaking German would keep his secrets safe. He'd thought I'd go quietly. I looked at Troy. He was crying now, silent tears running down his face. I said I didn't know if Troy felt genuine remorse or if he just regretted getting caught. I said I didn't know if prison would change him or just make him better at hiding who he really was. But I knew that what he'd done had consequences, and those consequences needed to match the severity of his crime. I said I wanted the maximum sentence, not because I was vindictive, but because what Troy had done deserved serious punishment. He'd betrayed the most fundamental trust that exists between a parent and child. He'd turned love into a weapon and family into a transaction. I thanked the judge and returned to my seat. My hands were shaking, but my voice had stayed steady throughout. The judge took a few minutes to review her notes. Then she looked at Troy and told him to stand. She said she'd reviewed all the evidence, read the pre-sentencing report, and considered the arguments from both sides. She said this was indeed an extraordinary case of betrayal. She said Troy had exploited his father's trust in the most calculated and cold-blooded way possible. She sentenced Troy to 20 years for conspiracy to commit murder, 5 years for elder abuse, 3 years for insurance fraud, 2 years for forgery, 2 years for theft of medical records, all sentences to run consecutively, total 32 years in prison. Troy's legs buckled. Sinclair grabbed his arm to steady him. The bailiff moved forward. The judge said Troy would be eligible for parole after serving 85% of his sentence, about 27 years. She said, given his age of 42, he'd be nearly 70 by the time he was released. She said she hoped he'd use that time to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. Then she banged her gavel. The bailiff led Troy away. He looked back at me once as they took him through the side door. I didn't look away. I watched until the door closed behind him. Saskia was sentenced the following week. She received 15 years for her role as an accomplice. Her student visa had been revoked, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement had a detainer on her. After serving her sentence, she'd be deported to Germany. In the weeks after sentencing, I started putting my life back together. I changed my will, leaving everything to Jenna and establishing a trust fund for my grandchildren. I updated my power of attorney and healthcare directives. I made sure everything was documented and official so there'd be no questions later. Jenna and I talked more regularly. She'd stopped defending Troy after hearing him testify, or rather, after hearing that he refused to testify. She said that was the moment she knew he was guilty, when he wouldn't take the stand and explain himself. She asked if I'd ever forgive him. I said I didn't know. Forgiveness felt like something far away, something I couldn't reach yet. In May, I started volunteering at a veterans center downtown. I'd go in twice a week and help older vets navigate VA benefits, fill out paperwork, make phone calls. Many of them were my age or older, and many of them had been abandoned by their families. I understood that now in a way I hadn't before. One afternoon, a Vietnam vet named Frank asked me why I volunteered. I told him the truth, that I was there because I was alive, and I needed to do something with that gift. Frank nodded like he understood. He said that made sense. I kept the house. For a while I'd considered selling it, moving somewhere smaller, starting fresh. But Patricia and I had built this house into a home over 38 years. We'd painted every wall, replaced every fixture, planted every tree in the yard. Leaving would have felt like letting Troy win, like letting him take something else from me. Instead, I reclaimed it. I repainted Troy's old bedroom, turning it into an office. I ripped out the carpet he and Saskia had walked on and replaced it with hardwood floors. I took down the heating vent in my bedroom and had it replaced with a solid return that didn't carry sound from room to room. I planted tomatoes in the backyard again. This time they grew tall and produced fruit that tasted like summer, warm and sweet and alive. In June I got a letter from Troy. It came through Monica's office, and she advised me again not to read it. This time I listened. I put the envelope in a drawer unopened. Maybe someday I'd read it, maybe not. Either way, I wasn't ready. In July, Jenna and her family came to visit for a week. My grandchildren were 8 and 10 now, energetic and loud in the way kids are. We went to the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum. We hiked in Sabino Canyon. We ate ice cream and watched movies and stayed up too late talking. On their last night, after the kids had gone to bed, Jenna asked me if I was happy. I thought about it for a long time. I said I wasn't sure happy was the right word, but I was okay. I was standing. I was moving forward. That felt like enough. She hugged me before they left the next morning. She said she was proud of me. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just hugged her back. By August, I'd settled into a new routine. I'd wake up at 6, take my blood pressure medication with orange juice, make coffee, and sit on the back porch watching the sunrise. Arizona sunrises are something special. The sky turns gold and pink and orange all at once, like the whole world is catching fire. I'd spend my mornings working on projects around the house. I fixed the fence in the backyard. I repaired the roof where some tiles had come loose. I built a new bookshelf for the living room. Working with my hands had always calmed me, and it did now more than ever. In the afternoons, I'd volunteer at the Veterans Center or run errands or just drive around Tucson, remembering what it felt like to be free and alive and safe in my own skin. In the evenings, I'd cook dinner, nothing fancy, just the kind of simple meals Patricia used to make: chicken and rice, tacos, spaghetti with meat sauce. I'd eat at the kitchen table with a book or the newspaper. Sometimes I'd put on music, usually the old country songs Patricia had loved. Before bed, I'd stand in front of her photograph in the bedroom. I'd tell her about my day, about Jenna and the grandkids, about the tomatoes growing in the backyard, about the fact that I was still here, still standing, still figuring out how to live with what had happened. People sometimes ask me if I'm angry. I tell them I'm not, and it's mostly true. Anger requires energy, and I've spent too much energy already on Troy and his choices. What I feel now is more like acceptance, heavy and sad and permanent, but not destructive. I accept that the son I thought I had never really existed. I accept that Troy made his choices for his own reasons, and those reasons had nothing to do with me. I accept that I can't fix him or save him or make him into someone different. All I can do is live, take my medication every morning, plant my garden every spring, show up for the people who show up for me, tell the truth when it matters, stand my ground when someone tries to take what's mine. Troy thought I couldn't understand German. He thought I was just an old man waiting to die. He thought age made me weak and ignorance made me vulnerable. He learned the hard way that living 69 years doesn't make you weak. It makes you experienced. It teaches you that survival isn't about strength. It's about patience and attention and knowing when to fight back. I survived a war. I survived 43 years in a factory. I survived losing the love of my life to cancer, and I survived my own son trying to kill me. If that's not strength, I don't know what is. So here's what I want you to know. Whoever you are, wherever you're watching this from, don't let anyone underestimate you because of your age. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're too old to matter, too tired to fight back, too confused to understand what's happening. You've lived long enough to earn your dignity. Don't let anyone take it from you. And if you're going through something similar, if you suspect someone in your family is trying to exploit you or harm you, document everything. Tell someone you trust. Get help. You don't have to face it alone. I'm still here. I'm still standing. And every morning when I take my blood pressure medication with that glass of orange juice, I'm reminded that I won. Not because Troy went to prison, but because I'm alive to see another sunrise. So where are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. Sometimes the best way to honor survival is to share it with others who need to know they're not alone. Thank you for listening. This is Leonard Vega, signing off.